Hey guys, this is Greg Benz, and in this video I'll show you how you can take a nasty, grungy, dirty building like this and take these various streaks of watermarks down sheet metal and clean them up quickly and easily in Photoshop. So the first thing about this, we could go and try and manually clone these items out, and it would take a very, very long time, and it would be hard to get a realistic looking result. But there is a quicker and easier way to do things, as there typically is in Photoshop, using various forms of blur. So first I'm going to hit Command J to duplicate the layer, and we're just going to call this our blur. And the first temptation might be to use Gaussian blur, and I'm just going to show why that would not work here. So if we go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur, and we can see even with just a few pixels we've already cleaned up a lot of the defect. I have to crease it a little bit more. Keep going until we've done a pretty good job of getting rid of things. But the issue that we're going to have if we zoom in here, just kind of take a look at this edge here between the before and after. We got this before, this very crisp edge right here, and afterwards everything's being blurred together, which means we're leaving kind of a halo on the inside of the sheet metal, not to mention some areas outside the sheet metal we'd have to deal with. So this isn't going to work very well for us because of those edge defects. So I'm going to cancel this, and instead we're going to use the surface blur tool to deal with this. Now the surface blur tool, if you're not familiar with it, is pretty processor intensive. So what we want to do is grab our marquee tool or any selection tool, just grab a chunk of the building that is representative of what you want to fix, and hit Command or Control J to create a new layer. Right click on it, and we're going to duplicate it into a new document. And the purpose here is to give us a smaller file to work with, so the blurring will go quickly. So I'm going to go to Image, Trim, and just get rid of all the transparent pixels. So now we have just this small little piece of the building, and we can find the filter settings that are going to work and then apply them to the larger image. So go Filter, Blur, Surface Blur. And just like the Gaussian blur tool, there's a radius which is going to take a given pixel and blur it within, in this case, 15 pixels. But then there's a secondary condition in surface blur, and this is really kind of the magic of the tool, this threshold, which basically says that if the pixels are within 30 grayscale values of each other, all the way up to a full 255, then it will blur them. And you can see when I move the threshold up, it blurred more of the image. So this is more or less what you'd get with a 15 pixel Gaussian blur. With surface blur, you can bring this back and try and discretely identify areas. So the lighter sheet metal versus the darker background, we're going to prevent blurring between these two areas simply by setting an appropriate threshold. So I think these values are actually going to work pretty well for us. It isn't perfect. We still have some areas that are not quite touched. We could play a little bit more and try and find values that eventually encompass those areas, but we're going to start blurring in the background if we set the threshold too high. And the radius is really probably not going to help us with this issue very much because these are already close together. So yeah, it's not really doing anything. So this is about as good as it's going to get with the blurring effect. But this is already a really good start. If we look at the original, we had all of these defects all over the image, and we've gotten rid of most of them, and we're just left with some much more manageable areas that we can fix. And some of these you don't even really have to deal with. You could choose to leave these alone. The point is we're reducing a significant amount of work. So we just need to remember 15 and 35. Those are the values we're going to use. I'm going to close this small temporary document and get rid of our temporary layer. And now we will blur our actual image. So we'll go to Filter, go to Blur, Surface Blur, and go with 15, and we like 35 here, and we'll say OK. And this filter will take just a moment to run. It is pretty intensive, as I mentioned. Okay, so now that we've got our blurred layer, let's just take a look and see what we had. Here is the before, and here's the after. And so it's done a really good job of taking care of a lot of the issues, but there's still some issues remaining. First, the blurring has taken some areas. For example, this is a true line we want. It has blurred some areas we wanted to keep. So we're going to have to mask a few areas back in, or for example, this stone arch underneath. We want to keep those. So we're going to have to locally apply the blur just where we want it. Second, if we look a little bit closer here, there's no texture in the blurred image versus the original had what looks like film grain. So we need to make sure we add some of that back in just to keep the effect looking realistic. And then thirdly, as I mentioned, there are still some areas like this where the filter just can't do everything, and we're going to have to manually go and fix that. So we'll just resort to old school cloning to take care of that. But that's all easy to do. So first thing, let's put this into a group by just hitting Control or Command G, and we'll just call this the blur group. And this is going to allow us to kind of just selectively work on this blurring in just the areas we want it. So let's zoom out here and just note, where are things looking good and where are they not. We can see that the blurring is going on the pipe, this building. There's a lot of areas that are getting blurred that shouldn't. So what we want to do is just mask in the rough areas where we should have blurring. So if we hold down Alt and click on the layer mask icon, we'll get a black mask. That was Alt clicking that. And now I'm just going to hit B for the brush, load up white paint, and I'm just going to paint over the areas of the building here. I'm using a Wacom pen, which makes it really easy to do this, over the areas that should get blurred. And I'm not worried about being overly precise with this because the surface blur tool is pretty good, and we're going to do a few things to refine it. And because we're doing this on a layer mask, it's completely non-destructive, and we can always fix it. For example, if I had accidentally blurred these areas, I can just switch with the X key back to black, paint black, and bring that back. So it's very easy to fix any issues we might find later. And I can see already in the middle of this I did miss one area, so let's just make sure we kind of hit all this here. Okay, so now we've got our surface blur applied just to these chunks of sheet metal. And let's go ahead and add back that grain that we're missing. So what we need to do is just add a new layer that's going to add grain. And if we Alt or Option click on the new layer icon, we'll get a few options. What we want to do is switch over to the overlay blend mode. That's the same thing you use for dodging and burning, and choose fill with overlay neutral color, 50% gray. So this is just going to create a gray layer in the overlay blend mode. So nothing is happening right now because overlay is going to look for things that are lighter or darker than gray and make adjustments. And what we need to do now is add noise to this layer, which will then show up as noise in the image. So we go to Filter, Noise, Add Noise. And I think if we add, looks about like the right amount at 2%. Gaussian and monochromatic are the settings you're going to want to use. And just hit OK. And now we can turn this noise layer off and on to kind of see how much effect we had there. I'm going to zoom in so you can see that a little bit better if you're looking on a small screen. So here is the noise being added to the blur layer. And if we turn our group on and off, this is going to show the original image versus what we have now. And the noise does look a little bit intense. So I want to take that opacity and bring it down to maybe about 50% or even a little bit less. And let's look before and after. So that has done a pretty good job. You can see it's really cleaned up these marks, but now we have a much more realistic looking texture. But as I look down a little bit, we still have some areas. So we, before and after, you can see that the blurring has occurred in these dark areas of the building, and we just want it in the light areas of the sheet metal. So what we need to do is either take the mask we've already added, and we could go through and manually black out those areas, which would be pretty tedious, or we can just put another mask on top of this to wipe things out, and that's going to be a much easier approach. I'm going to click our group, hit Command or Control G again. So I put a group over a group, and we're going to put a mask here to control this mask in just a second. But first we need to create the selection that we want. And there's a couple ways you could approach this. One, if you're using a luminosity masking panel like my Lumenzia panel, you could simply create a luminosity mask that is selective to the lighter areas. In this case, I would want to customize my mask by just simply making a levels adjustment in the temporary Lumenzia layers. And then I can just click on my group and hit mask, and I'm going to apply a luminosity mask. And so this mask is being applied to the underlying mask, and that's going to, if we see this before here with this disabled versus after, the luminosity mask has really helped to protect these darker areas. So that's the way you could approach it if you have Lumenzia. I'm going to delete this and show you if you don't have Lumenzia, another way that you can do this is simply to use the magic wand tool. So we'll load up the wand, and we're going to click on the darker areas of the building, and I've got it set to a tolerance of 30, and it's not contiguous. So basically it selected everything that was within 30 of what I just clicked on, and I can see these little gray areas of the building didn't quite make it. So I could go and sort of try and manually click on them, and that's actually starting to knock out chunks of the building. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. If I switch back to contiguous, and I'm just holding the Shift key here, so I'm going to add to my selection. But now that it's contiguous, it's only going to apply to these little areas. And I could approach this a few other ways, but this is a pretty efficient way of getting to things. Actually, let's see here. We're still affecting the building, so I'm going to let's start over. Let's deselect. Select on the building here, and I guess we need to make it non-contiguous again, so we get everything. So that's pretty good. We are going to have to just manually paint these areas out. That's probably going to be the easiest way to deal with them. So what we have right now is a selection of all the dark stuff. What we want is a selection of the light stuff. So we're going to select inverse. So now the sheet metal is selected. And we want to refine this edge to make sure it's going to be a natural looking edge. So when I hit refine edge, make sure you're set to overlay, and then everything that's red is the stuff that is masked out. So we can zoom in and just check the quality of our edges here. And you can see there's kind of this jagged edge, and that's something that the surface blur filter did. So it didn't have a big halo like Gaussian blur, but there is still a little bit of an issue. And we can fix that by just simply masking over those areas to make sure the original shines through at the edges. So a little bit of feather may have already taken care of that. That looks pretty good. I'm going to still shift the edge a little bit here. And that's just going to make sure. So now those edges are fully covered. And I'm going to say OK. So now we've got a selection of the sheet metal with a little bit of a protective buffer at the edges. And even if there was some staining at these edges, you can't see it. So that's a very safe approach. And now we'll just simply click to add a new layer mask, and our selection's been turned into a mask. So when we click on this, this is what we have in here, and it looks quite a bit like the luminosity mask we had. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's generally speaking about the same approach. Now I mentioned we've got these areas here we're going to have to get rid of, and I'll show you in a second here why. If we go back, so we can see just by shift clicking on this mask, here it was before we had the mask, and here it is after. And as I zoom in here, we've gone from this nasty haloed mess in the background to this, which looks a lot better. But if we look at our original, we can still see that there's some issues here. And that's simply because we have these areas masked in, and we just need to black them out. So I'm going to switch with B to the brush, use my bracket keys to make it a little bit smaller, switch over to black paint, and because there's really nothing around here, this is very easy to freehand paint this. So we're just going to knock out these little areas that shouldn't be selected just to make sure we aren't blurring any details that aren't sheet metal here. And one last little bit here. And I may go back later and do this a little bit more precisely. You can also see this area here has been affected. I'm going to turn down my flow a little bit because I want to be a little more careful here. And let's go ahead and also black this area out to make sure we keep that detail. So that should be pretty good now in terms of protecting these areas. We can again go back and keep tweaking some of this as we need to, but we have added in now this blurring to smooth out these key areas of the building. Again, if we look at kind of before and after, we've really cleaned up the metal a lot in those harsh areas. And what's left now are just a few areas where we can go in these edges and make sure these areas stay black, and then deal with the cloning that's left after that. So zooming in here, if we look at before and after, we can see there's some areas that are getting blurred that shouldn't be. So we can simply just black them out. And because this is a pretty intricate mask, I'm going to add a third mask to it because it's going to be easier to undo if I want to. So I'm going to hit Command G again. We've added yet another group, and I'm going to click to add a white mask to it. And now anything I paint black on here will go away. So I'm going to turn on my brush tool, and if I paint black, we can knock things out here. But you can see if I ever make a mistake, I can just hit the X key to switch back to white. and I can put it right back. So that's why using multiple masks can be really nice. So we added the first mask to just locally add it where we needed it. The second mask using a luminosity mask or a selection of the darks with a little bit of edge refinement to knock out the shadow areas of this first selection. And then this last piece, it's just going to be subtle little refinements, and by putting it on its own layer, that will let us quickly and easily undo anything we need to. So I'm just going to click and shift click to paint with my brush, and actually I'm just going to take the flow way up here. So again, if we just click, shift click, that's drawing a straight line. And now in these more subtle areas here, I may zoom in a little bit and turn down my flow and just kind of freehand this. But I'm basically just going to go through here, and if there's any areas like this I want to clean up, I'm just going to quickly paint them back and just make sure that I didn't blur any key details. So I'm just going to run around the image and just quickly do that. So I finished cleaning up all these little black lines. Didn't really take that long, and one of the keys really is when you're doing this, you can just simply click and shift click across multiple segments to draw a line all the way across, since they are perfectly aligned. So it actually didn't take that long. So now that we've got that cleaned up, the last piece we need to address are just some of these remaining little imperfections. There's still some areas that aren't quite right. And like I said, we're just gonna have to go back to traditional cloning to get rid of these. But we can still take advantage of all the masking work we've done by putting a layer in here right around here. That way we'll take advantage of the grain and all the layers above it. So we'll just clone to these areas here, and it'll automatically exclude the black for us. So I'm just going to go ahead and click for a new layer. We'll call this clone. And the reason we're going to clone here is if we use the healing brush, then you start to see weird artifacts. For example, I'm going to hit J for the healing brush. And if I just try and source something down here, when I paint up here, as soon as I hit these edges, things start to get really kind of weird there. So I'm going to undo that. So we don't want the healing brush. Instead, we're going to use the clone stamp. So hit S for the clone stamp. And then just pick something that looks like the destination color you want. In this case, most of the colors seem to run kind of diagonally. You can see some of the sky reflection here. We want to avoid those colors and just stick with more of these lighter colors that we want here. So I'm going to use this as my source and just start to clone right over things here. And I'm going to turn off the aligned function so I can just keep pulling from the same area here. Now you see as I run off the top edge here, because we're working within this layer set here, even though this thing ran off the top, if I disable these layers, eventually we'll find, yep, it went right off the edge here. But since we're working inside of this stack of layers, that's going to give us automatic protection. And the fact that we're working underneath the grain layer is going to help deal with the fact that blurring layer over layer partially here can get rid of some of the grain. So that's just going to make sure that whatever we do, at the end of the day, we've got some nice grain left in here. And the more you can work with kind of intermediate flows and different samples, the more you can avoid some of these issues I'm seeing here where the colors don't quite match. That's the challenge of using clone stamp tools. You just want to make sure that the colors kind of have a nice bleed to them, and lower opacities are going to work well, and that's where keeping that grain is just going to help deal with that issue there. So I'm just going to go around the image looking for more stuff like that, and we'll come back to the finished image. And so now here we have our final image, and you can see here's the original with all these various water spots all over the metal here in the final, where things look much, much cleaner. So just kind of recapping the steps we went through, started off by adding a surface blur to a duplicate of the image. And then we've added some cloning at the end here that just dealt with a few particular problem areas. Added some noise to make sure we had texture in the image. And then we just have a progressive set of layer masks added to groups so that we could selectively knock out the areas we don't want this. So we started by knocking out everything that wasn't the building, and then we added another mask in here that was going to protect the shadows and knock out those parts of the building that were in shadow. But that was kind of a quick and dirty mask we made, so we didn't get all the lines, and so we added one more final mask here that just got at these other lines in the building and a few other little problem areas to kind of clean up. So essentially everything that is white in all three of these masks will shine through. So it's in the building, but not in the shadows or not in these other lines, bringing this all through. So I hope you found that helpful. Please leave some comments and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel as well as my newsletter at gregbensphotography.com/newsletter to get more tutorials like this. Thanks.